I grew up hearing the stories about the forest that bordered our small village, a sleepy place nestled deep in the rural outskirts of Ontario. Everyone knew better than to venture too far into those woods. The forest had been cursed, or so the old tales said. It was a curse placed upon it by a traveler, an outsider who, after being driven away by the villagers centuries ago, cast his wrath upon the trees. People whispered that anyone who went in too far never came out. Disappearances spanning generations haunted our community. Families left broken, and the village left with a gnawing fear that permeated every conversation about the forest. I never believed those stories. I thought they were just superstitions, tales to keep children in line. That was until my older brother, Jake, went missing. It was a cold autumn evening, the wind howling through the streets, and Jake had promised to be home before dark. He loved wandering off into the woods, always pushing his limits, always testing fate. But this time he didn't return. By nightfall, panic set in. My parents and the other villagers launched a search party, but no one would dare go deep into the forest. They called it off after only a few hours. I was furious. How could they give up so easily? Jake was my brother. I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. So, that night, while everyone was asleep, I took a flashlight and headed for the forest edge, determined to find him. The woods were eerily quiet as I stepped through the underbrush. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig sent a shiver down my spine. The deeper I went, the thicker the darkness became, swallowing the beam of my flashlight. The stories of the cursed forest played over in my mind, but I pushed them away. Jake was out there somewhere. I called his name over and over again, but the only response was the wind. An unsettling sensation crept over me, like I was being watched. I kept turning, trying to catch a glimpse of something, anything behind me, but every time I looked, there was nothing. Just the trees, standing like silent sentinels. After what felt like hours, I found something. It wasn't Jake, but it was his jacket, snagged on a low branch. My heart raced as I grabbed it, the fabric still warm to the touch, as if he had just been there. But where was he? I continued on, my pulse quickening with every step. The forest seemed to change around me, the air growing thicker, suffocating even. My breath came in short gasps as panic clawed at my chest. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but I started hearing something, whispers, low and unintelligible, carried on the wind. I froze. The whispers were getting louder, and they weren't just voices. There was something else, something deeper, more primal, hidden beneath the human tones. I could feel eyes on me, cold, unblinking eyes. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand. My legs felt like they were sinking into the earth, as if the forest itself was pulling me down. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root, and as I hit the ground, the flashlight slipped from my grip, flickering wildly before plunging me into darkness. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, echoing in my mind, repeating the same word over and over. Leave! I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight, and without thinking, I turned and ran. The trees blurred by as I sprinted, branches clawing at my skin, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The whispers followed me, chasing me out of the cursed woods. It wasn't until I saw the faint lights of the village ahead that I dared to look back. The forest was still, silent, but I knew it wasn't over. Jake never came back, and neither did anyone else who wandered in after him. Now I know the truth about the curse. It wasn't just a story. The forest takes what it wants, and it's only a matter of time before it calls for me too. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the old, weather-beaten trunk in the attic. It was massive, covered in layers of dust that hinted at how long it had been left untouched. We had moved into this rented house just a few weeks ago, and I had been putting off exploring the attic, knowing how creepy it seemed from the first glance. But curiosity got the better of me. The house itself wasn't old, but the attic was a different story. The wooden beams creaked above, and the air was thick with dust, particles floating like ghosts in the narrow beams of light filtering through the tiny windows. It was oppressive up there, The kind of quiet that makes you acutely aware of every creak and groan of the building. I hadn't told anyone about the trunk. My housemates, Ethan and Liam, weren't the kind to get excited over old relics. They probably would have laughed it off, called it junk, and suggested throwing it out. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about it. It was locked, of course, and I had no way to open it. But the mere sight of it, looming there in the dim light, seemed like an invitation. I bent down, inspecting the rusty lock. That's when I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible, but distinct enough to send a chill up my spine. A noise, a low groaning sound, coming from behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight beam dancing across the attic's dark corners. Nothing, just boxes, old furniture, and shadows stretching across the wooden floor. I let out a breath, forcing a nervous laugh. I was being ridiculous. It was an old house, old with creaks. That's all. I turned back to the trunk, determined to open it. My fingers traced the edges of the lock, trying to figure out a way to break it open. That's when I heard it again, louder this time, a soft, scraping sound like something dragging across the floor. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around again, this time catching sight of a shadow shifting in the corner. I froze. A dark shape loomed just beyond the edge of the flashlight's reach, something large, unmoving, but unmistakably there. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady as I aimed the flashlight at it, the beam flickering weakly as if struggling to reveal what was hiding in the darkness. And then I saw it. Massive antlers, twisted and gnarled, attached to the head of some kind of beast that seemed to be watching me. Its eyes glinted for a brief second in the dim light, and I felt my legs lock up in fear. It was blocking my only way out, standing between me and the attic door. I couldn't move. My body refused to respond as a wave of cold terror washed over me. I was trapped. The attic felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in, the air thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but I couldn't. It was real, too real. I gripped the flashlight tighter, backing away slowly, trying to inch my way toward the door without drawing attention. But the more I moved, the louder the scraping sound became. It wasn't just watching me. It was getting closer. I wanted to scream for Ethan and Liam, but my voice caught in my throat. Every instinct told me to run, but my feet were frozen in place. The shape moved again, and I caught a glimpse of something else, something wooden, hanging in the air, a moose head, mounted on the wall, just beyond the shadow. I blinked, realizing with a rush of embarrassment that the creature I'd been so terrified of was nothing more than a dusty old hunting trophy, its massive antlers casting a grotesque shadow that had sent my mind spiraling. Relief washed over me, and I laughed, a nervous, shaky sound. The tension in my chest released, and I finally moved, stepping toward the door, my heart still pounding from the adrenaline. I was almost at the exit when I heard it again, a low groaning. Not from the moose head, but from beneath the floorboards. Something shifted under my feet, a dull thud echoing in the quiet attic. I froze, flashlight shaking as I directed the beam down toward the floor. Dust shifted, rising up in soft clouds, and I could feel it. The floor wasn't solid beneath me. I stumbled back, my eyes wide, scanning the floorboards as they groaned under some unseen weight. Something was under there. Something moving, shifting just beneath the surface. The attic door creaked open, and Ethan poked his head through, grinning like an idiot. "You coming down or what? Dinner's ready." I glanced from him to the floor, still trying to process what I had just felt, what I had heard. The groaning stopped, as if whatever was below had been waiting for Ethan's interruption. I forced a smile, nodded, and followed him down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me from below, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I never went back up to the attic after that. I'd always loved the outdoors. The sense of freedom that came with it, the vastness of nature, it made me feel alive. So, when I decided to take a solo backpacking trip through the wilds of British Columbia, I was excited. I had done plenty of hiking before, but this trip was going to be different. Remote, isolated, and completely on my own. No distractions, no other people. Just me and the wilderness. It was the third day of my hike when things started to go wrong. I had planned my route meticulously, packing just enough supplies for the week. My GPS was supposed to guide me along the trails, but the terrain was more rugged than I had expected. The path was barely visible in some areas, overgrown with shrubs and fallen trees. That morning, thick fog rolled in, making visibility nearly impossible. I tried to follow the trail markers, but each step seemed to take me further from where I was supposed to be. My GPS was acting up, losing signal every few minutes, and the fog distorted everything. What had started as a peaceful trek quickly turned into a fight to stay on course. I pushed forward, hoping the fog would lift, but the hours ticked by, and it only grew thicker. That's when I slipped. One wrong step on the wet rocks, and suddenly I was tumbling down a steep incline. I heard the crack before I felt the pain. My leg twisted beneath me as I hit the ground hard. The pain was immediate and sharp, shooting up through my knee. I bit down on a scream, knowing there was no one out here to hear me. Panic set in. My mind raced as I tried to stand, but my leg buckled beneath me, sending fresh waves of agony through my body. I was alone, injured, and completely lost. The fog had swallowed the world around me, turning the forest into a maze of shadows and sounds that I couldn't trust. I sat there for what felt like hours, clutching my leg, trying to think. I needed to move. Staying still in the middle of the wilderness wasn't an option. I grabbed my pack, using it as a makeshift crutch, and hobbled in the direction I thought was right. Every step was torture, but stopping wasn't an option. The fog played tricks on my eyes, making the trees look like towering figures, leaning in closer with each step. The sound of the wind through the leaves became a low whisper, like voices just out of earshot. I knew it was just the pain and exhaustion getting to me, but it didn't matter. The isolation started to gnaw at me, an oppressive weight settling on my chest. Hours passed, and the sun was setting. The fog still hadn't lifted. I was cold, hungry, and my leg was swelling fast. My mind spiraled into dark thoughts. What if I didn't make it? What if no one found me? The wilderness had a way of swallowing people whole, leaving no trace of them behind. I could be one of those people, another lost hiker, never seen again. Just as I was about to collapse from exhaustion, I saw it, a small, weathered cabin, half hidden by the fog and trees. It looked ancient, like something out of a forgotten time. Relief washed over me like a wave. Someone had to be there, someone who could help. I hobbled to the door, banging on it with the last bit of strength I had left. "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice was hoarse, desperate. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a man. He was old, with wild gray hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. His clothes were worn, and his eyes were sharp, taking me in with a single glance. "You're hurt," he said simply, stepping aside to let me in. I collapsed into the cabin, grateful for the warmth of the fire burning in the hearth. The walls were lined with old, hand-carved furniture, and the place smelled like wood smoke and earth. It was a strange contrast to the chaos outside, a bubble of safety in the middle of the wild. The man introduced himself as Henry. He didn't ask many questions, just helped me bandage my leg and gave me water. His silence was unsettling, but I was too tired to care. The fire crackled as we sat in silence, the fog pressing against the small windows. "You were lucky to find this place," he said after a long while, his voice low. "Not many do." I nodded, too exhausted to respond. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a sense of safety for the first time all day. But that feeling didn't last long. I woke in the middle of the night to a strange sound. It was soft at first, like something scraping against the outside of the cabin. My heart raced as I lay there listening. The sound grew louder, closer, as if something or someone was circling the cabin. I sat up, wincing from the pain in my leg. Henry was still sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. He didn't move, didn't react to the noise. "Henry," I whispered, "do you hear that?" He didn't answer, just kept staring into the fire. The scraping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from right outside the door now, something heavy dragging across the ground. A cold dread settled over me. I wanted to get up, to see what it was, but fear kept me frozen in place. Henry finally turned to look at me, his eyes shadowed by the firelight. "Don't open the door," he said, his voice steady. "No matter what you hear, no matter what you think is out there, don't open it." I nodded, my throat tight with fear. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, and when morning finally came, the fog had lifted. Henry walked me to the edge of the woods, guiding me back to the path that led out of the wilderness. I never asked him about the sounds. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that something was out there, something that didn't want me to leave. That trip changed me. The wilderness wasn't just vast and beautiful. It was dangerous. It was alive. And now, whenever I hike alone, I always think of that night in the cabin and the thing that was waiting just outside the door. I was visiting New York City for the first time. The energy of the city was electrifying, and I couldn't wait to experience everything it had to offer. After a day of exploring, my friend Ashley and I decided to treat ourselves to dinner at this popular restaurant we'd heard about. It was one of those trendy spots in Manhattan, always packed, reservations made weeks in advance. But by some stroke of luck, we managed to get a table that evening. As we stepped inside, I was immediately taken by the ambience. The dim lighting, the soft hum of conversation, the clink of glasses. It was perfect. The kind of place where you could lose yourself in the atmosphere. The scent of fresh bread and roasted garlic hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt like I was in for a perfect night. The waiter led us to a table near the back, close to the kitchen doors. It wasn't the best spot, but I didn't care. We ordered drinks and started chatting about our day, enjoying the break from the chaotic streets outside. Everything was going smoothly until halfway through our meal. Ashley was telling me a story, something funny that had happened earlier, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A flash of movement on the floor. I turned my head slightly, not thinking much of it at first. Maybe a napkin had fallen, or someone had dropped something. But then I saw it again. Something small, dark, darting across the floor between the tables. "What was that?" I muttered, cutting Ashley off mid-sentence. She frowned and looked around, her eyes scanning the floor. "I didn't see anything," she said, taking a sip of her wine. "Probably just your imagination." I wanted to believe her, but something didn't sit right with me. I leaned down slightly, peering under the table, and that's when I saw it, a rat. Not just any rat. This thing was massive, about the size of a small cat, its fur matted and greasy as it scurried across the polished floor. My stomach lurched, and I jerked back in my seat, my eyes wide. "What is it?" Ashley asked, her voice rising with concern. "There's a rat," I whispered, trying not to cause a scene. But my heart was pounding now. The thought of that filthy creature running around where we were eating sending chills down my spine. Ashley leaned over, looking under the table, and her face paled. "Oh my God," she muttered. Before I could react, the rat darted across the floor again, this time closer to our table. It shot past the legs of a nearby couple, disappearing under the kitchen doors. My skin crawled, and I could see Ashley starting to panic too. The restaurant continued its quiet hum around us, completely unaware of the vermin invasion happening under their feet. "We need to tell someone," I said, my voice trembling. Ashley nodded, but as we raised our hands to call over the waiter, something worse happened. There was a shriek, a high-pitched scream that cut through the air, silencing the room. Everyone turned toward the source of the noise, a woman sitting just a few tables away. She had leapt up from her chair, her face twisted in horror, and pointed at the floor. The rat was back, but this time, it wasn't alone. Another one, just as large, just as grotesque, had appeared, scurrying out from under the kitchen door. And then another, and another. Within seconds, the restaurant floor was alive with them, their small bodies darting between chairs, over shoes, slipping under tables. Chaos erupted. People screamed. Chairs scraped back as diners jumped to their feet, trying to avoid the rats that seemed to be pouring out from every corner. Glasses shattered, and silverware clattered to the floor as tables were abandoned in a panic. My heart was pounding in my chest as I stood up, the sight of the rats, too many to count, sending waves of nausea through me. Ashley grabbed my arm, her face pale with fear. "Let's go," she gasped, tugging me toward the door. But the rats were everywhere, scurrying across our path, blocking the exits. They moved in strange, erratic patterns, almost like they were searching for something, weaving in and out of the maze of tables and chairs. I could hear the restaurant staff shouting, trying to contain the chaos, but it was too late. One of the rats leapt onto a nearby chair, its beady eyes fixed on me for a moment. My breath caught in my throat as I locked eyes with it. It wasn't afraid. It wasn't fleeing like a normal rat. It was staring me down. We pushed through the panicked crowd, finally reaching the door, the noise behind us deafening as the rats continued their invasion. Outside, the cool night air hit my face like a slap, and I could finally breathe again. I turned back toward the restaurant, watching as more people poured out onto the street, some still shouting in panic, others laughing nervously, unsure what they had just witnessed. Ashley and I stood there for a moment, catching our breath. The night had turned from a perfect New York experience into something out of a nightmare. I couldn't shake the image of those rats, the way they moved, the way they seemed almost coordinated. We didn't talk much after that. We just grabbed our things and left, not looking back. But even now, I can't help but wonder, how did so many of them get in? Why were they acting like that? And why, out of all the tables, did they seem to focus on ours? That night still haunts me. Whenever I think about dining out, I can't shake the memory of those rats. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see their beady little eyes staring back at me, unblinking. The elevator door slid open with a soft ding, and I stepped inside, heading to the top floor of the apartment building where my new client lived. It was just past 8 p.m., and the building was quiet, too quiet, really, considering it was in the middle of Manhattan. The hallways had been deserted, the air thick with an unsettling stillness that made me feel like I was the only person in the entire building. I glanced at the elevator's control panel. There were only 10 floors, and I needed to reach the 9th. I hit the button, leaned against the wall, and waited as the doors slid shut with a soft hum. That's when the lights flickered. It was subtle at first, a quick dimming, and then back to normal. I barely registered it, brushing it off as a quirk of an old building. But then, as the elevator began to ascend, the lights flickered again, longer this time, leaving me in near darkness for what felt like an eternity. A sense of dread settled in my chest. I felt a chill creep up my spine, like the elevator itself was warning me. I hit the 9th floor button again, just to be sure, but the elevator continued its slow, creaking ascent. I tried to steady my breathing, focusing on the numbers above the door as they lit up with each passing floor. 3 for 5, the lights flickered again. This time they stayed off longer. The faint hum of the elevator was the only sound, and I could hear my own breathing, harsh and shallow, echoing in the small, enclosed space. When the lights finally came back on, I was no longer alone. I froze. There was someone standing in the corner of the elevator, a man tall, with a pale face and dark eyes, his features sharp and gaunt. He was dressed in a shabby suit, like something from a different era, his posture unnaturally stiff. His eyes were locked on me, cold and unblinking, like he had been watching me for hours. I hadn't heard the elevator stop. I hadn't heard the doors open. "Can I help you?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper, my heart hammering in my chest. He didn't answer. He just stood there staring. The elevator continued to rise, but something was wrong. The numbers on the control panel flickered wildly, the floors passing by without any rhyme or reason. The man didn't move. His eyes never left mine. 6-8, 7-5, the numbers blurred together, jumping erratically. I hit the emergency stop button, but nothing happened. The elevator continued its maddening ascent, rising higher and higher, though the floors it displayed made no sense. I turned toward the man, my panic rising. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice shaking. Still no answer. Then the elevator jolted to a stop, the lights flickering one last time before plunging me into total darkness. I stood there, frozen in place, the only sound the rapid beating of my own heart. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a voice, deep and raspy, coming from the corner where the man stood. "You shouldn't have gotten in." I whipped my head around, straining to see him in the dark. but all I could make out was his outline, a shadow among shadows. "You should have waited," the voice said again, this time closer, though I hadn't heard him move. My stomach twisted in fear, the air growing thick and cold around me. It felt like the elevator was shrinking, pressing in on me. The lights flickered back on for a brief second, and I could see him. Right in front of me, inches from my face, his cold, lifeless eyes staring into mine. His lips twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I stumbled back, gasping, trying to press myself against the wall, but there was nowhere to go. I could feel his breath on my face, cold and rancid. And then the lights went out again. The elevator began to move, but it wasn't going up anymore. It was going down. Fast. Too fast. I could feel the pressure building in my ears, the pit of my stomach dropping as the elevator plummeted, the numbers on the panel blinking erratically once more. 10987, but it didn't stop. The air felt thinner, my chest tightening as I struggled to breathe. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat, swallowed by the darkness. Just when I thought the elevator would never stop, it jolted violently, throwing me to the floor. I lay there, gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The lights flickered once more, dimly illuminating the small space. The man was gone. I scrambled to my feet, my hands shaking as I frantically pressed the button for the 9th floor. The elevator dinged, like nothing had happened, and the door slid open to reveal a long, empty hallway. I stumbled out, not even bothering to look back, my legs trembling as I half ran down the corridor. As I reached my client's door, I paused for a moment, glancing back at the elevator. The doors were still open, the light inside soft and warm, as if nothing had ever happened. But just before I turned away, I saw something, a flash of movement, a shadow, shifting inside the elevator. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly knocked on the door, desperate to be anywhere but near that cursed elevator. The door opened, and my client greeted me with a smile. "You're early," she said cheerfully. I glanced at my watch. I was early by exactly 15 minutes. I nodded, forcing a smile, but the knot of dread in my stomach didn't loosen. As I stepped inside the apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I left later that night, I didn't take the elevator. I took the stairs. But as I descended, I heard a soft ding behind me. I turned, glancing back at the elevator doors as they slid open one last time. No one stepped out, but I swear I could hear his voice. "See you on the 9th floor." And now, whenever I enter a building, I hesitate at the sight of an elevator. I take the stairs whenever I can, because no matter where I go, no matter how many floors I climb, I know he's waiting for the moment I step inside. It was a typical late-night shift for me, cruising through the empty streets of Sydney, just trying to make a few extra bucks before heading home. The roads were quiet, the lights from the city casting an eerie glow over everything. I didn't mind the night shift. It was usually peaceful, a time when the city's usual chaos settled down into something more bearable. It was just past midnight when I got the request. A remote pickup, way out near the mountains. Odd, I thought. No one usually requested a ride from that far out, especially not at this time of night. But I needed the money, and I figured it was just someone looking to get back into the city after a late dinner or something. I headed out, the roads getting narrower and darker as I left the bright lights of the city behind. The further I drove, the more uneasy I felt. The landscape became barren, the houses fewer and farther between, until eventually there was nothing but the looming silhouette of the mountains in the distance. Finally, I arrived at the pickup point. It was an old road, half overgrown with weeds, leading up to a dilapidated house that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 1 a.m. now. I waited, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror, scanning the road for any sign of movement. That's when I saw her. A woman stepped out from the shadows, her long white dress trailing behind her as she approached the car. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, which was pale, almost unnaturally so. She moved slowly, deliberately, like she was gliding over the ground rather than walking. My stomach twisted with unease. There was something off about her, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way she held herself, the way her eyes seemed to lock onto mine as she got closer to the car. I rolled down the window as she reached the passenger side. "You need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though I could feel my pulse quicken. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me for a long moment before nodding once. Her movements were slow, almost mechanical. I unlocked the door, and she slid into the back seat without a word. "Where to?" I asked, glancing back at her in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were fixed out the window, staring into the darkness, her expression blank. "Up the mountain," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was something strange about the way she spoke, a kind of flatness, like there was no emotion behind the words. I hesitated, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "Up the mountain," I repeated, trying to make sense of the request. There was nothing up there. No houses, no businesses. Just wilderness and an old, abandoned lookout. "Yes," she replied, her voice soft, distant. "Take me there." I swallowed hard, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something about this wasn't right, but I couldn't just leave her out here in the middle of nowhere. Against my better judgment, I put the car in gear and started driving. The road up the mountain was narrow and winding, the trees closing in on both sides, making it feel like we were being swallowed by the forest. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, trying to catch another glimpse of her, but she was barely visible in the darkness, her face turned toward the window, still staring out into the night. The silence was oppressive, the only sound the steady hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the car as it navigated the rough road. I tried to make small talk, but she didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear me. It was like she was in her own world, somewhere far away from the confines of the car. As we climbed higher, the air grew colder, and a thick mist began to settle over the road. My headlights barely cut through it, and I had to slow down to avoid driving off the edge. That's when I noticed something strange. No matter how far we drove, no matter how many times I glanced in the rearview mirror, her reflection wasn't there. The back seat was empty, but when I looked over my shoulder, she was still sitting there, as real as ever. I blinked, my heart racing. What the hell was going on? I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light, but the feeling of unease gnawed at me. I could feel her presence behind me, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The air in the car felt colder, heavier. "Are we almost there?" she whispered suddenly, her voice so close it sent a chill down my spine. "Almost," I muttered, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't know how much longer I could take this. I just wanted to drop her off and get the hell out of there. We rounded the last bend, and the old lookout came into view, a crumbling structure perched on the edge of the mountain, barely visible through the fog. I slowed the car to a stop, my hands shaking as I turned to face her. "We're here," I said, my voice barely audible. She didn't move. For a moment, she just sat there, staring at the lookout with those hollow, dark eyes. Then, without a word, she opened the door and stepped out into the fog. I watched her walk toward the edge of the mountain, her figure disappearing into the mist. For a split second, I thought I saw her feet lift off the ground like she was floating, but I blinked and she was gone. My heart was pounding in my chest as I waited, unsure of what to do next. That's when I heard it. Her voice, soft and clear, like she was standing right next to me. "Thank you." I whipped my head around, but the back seat was empty. No one was there. I didn't wait another second. I slammed the car into reverse, my hands trembling as I sped down the mountain road. The fog clung to the car, thick and suffocating, and I could still feel her presence, like she was sitting right behind me, watching me drive away. By the time I reached the base of the mountain, the fog had lifted, and the night was eerily calm. But something told me I wasn't alone. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and for a split second, I saw her. Her pale face staring back at me, her lips curved into a faint, ghostly smile. When I reached the city, I pulled over and tried to collect myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still with me. Now, every time I drive past the mountains, I think about her, about the woman in white who vanished into the fog. And I can't help but wonder if she's still out there, waiting for her next ride, waiting for the next driver to take her to her final destination. I haven't driven that route since. The Pacific Coast Highway, or as most people call it, the PCH, is supposed to be one of the most beautiful drives in the world. And it is. Winding roads, stunning ocean views, cliffs that drop into the crashing waves below. It's breathtaking. That's why my friends, Luke and Sarah, and I decided to take a road trip down the PCH. We wanted a carefree adventure, a time to bond, and a chance to experience the wild freedom of the open road. We packed up Luke's old beat-up SUV with snacks, blankets, and a playlist that could last for days. The first few hours of the drive were everything we'd hoped for, laughing, singing along to our favorite songs, and stopping at scenic overlooks to take in the views. The sun was starting to set when we hit one of the more remote stretches of the highway, where the cliffs loomed high on one side, and the ocean seemed to stretch out endlessly on the other. That's when we saw him, a lone figure standing by the side of the road, his thumbs sticking out in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. His appearance was rugged, disheveled hair, a worn-out jacket, and jeans that looked like they hadn't seen a washing machine in weeks. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, and he stood unnaturally still, like he'd been waiting for us. I felt a pit form in my stomach as we passed him. Something about him didn't sit right with me, but Sarah, always the bleeding heart, leaned forward from the back seat and said, "We should pick him up. It's getting dark, and we can't leave him out here." Luke and I exchanged a glance. I could tell he wasn't thrilled with the idea either, but before I could protest, Sarah was already rolling down the window as we slowed down. "Hey, you need a lift?" The man nodded once, without a word, and walked toward the car. I felt a shiver crawl down my spine as he opened the door and slid into the seat beside me. He smelled of sweat and something else, something metallic, almost like blood. "Where are you headed?" Luke asked, trying to sound casual as he pulled back onto the road. The man didn't answer for a long time. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his sunglasses still covering his eyes, even though the sun had dipped below the horizon. "North," he finally muttered, his voice low and rough. There was something unsettling about the way he said it, like he wasn't telling the whole truth. Sarah, ever the conversationalist, tried to engage him. "Oh, are you a traveler?" "Backpacking." Again, silence. Then he spoke again, slowly this time. "I'm a veteran." That should have made me feel better. I mean, veterans were supposed to be trustworthy, right? They'd served the country, sacrificed everything. But the way he said it didn't bring me any comfort. If anything, it made the air in the car feel heavier. The highway was getting darker now, and the cliffs seemed to close in around us. The wind howled through the open windows, making the inside of the car feel cold and distant. I couldn't stop glancing over at the man, trying to see past those dark glasses, but his face remained unreadable. "Thanks for the ride," he said after what felt like hours of silence, though it had only been a few minutes. Not many people stop for guys like me. I forced a smile, trying to shake off the unease gnawing at me. Luke's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I could tell he felt it too. This strange tension, like something bad was just waiting to happen. Sarah, always too trusting, handed him a water bottle. "No problem. We're happy to help." The man didn't take it. He just kept staring straight ahead, his hands resting unervingly still on his knees. The miles ticked by, the silence stretching between us, broken only by the sound of the wind and the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. Then he spoke again. "You should be careful out here," he said, his voice even quieter this time, almost a whisper. "Not everyone you pick up is safe." A chill shot through me. I turned to look at him, but his face was still unreadable behind those sunglasses. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't joking. There was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. "Yeah, well," Luke said, his voice tight, "we're heading into town soon. We can drop you off there." The man didn't respond. He just kept staring out the windshield. The darkness was pressing in now, the headlights barely illuminating the winding road ahead. I felt the pit in my stomach grow. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I glanced at Sarah in the rearview mirror, but she was oblivious, scrolling through her phone, probably looking for the next song to play. Suddenly, the man leaned forward, his voice sharp and commanding. "Pull over." Luke's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, meeting mine. "What?" "Pull over," the man repeated, more forcefully this time. "I need to get out." My heart pounded in my chest. There was nothing out here, just cliffs and ocean. No houses, no lights, no reason for him to get out. But the tone in his voice wasn't one to argue with. Luke slowed the car, pulling off to the side of the road. The moment we stopped, the man was out of the car, slamming the door behind him. He didn't look back, didn't say a word, just started walking down the side of the highway, disappearing into the darkness. For a long moment, none of us spoke. We just sat there, the car idling, our breaths coming fast and shallow. I could still feel the tension in the air, like we had just dodged something terrible, something unspeakable. "Let's get out of here," Luke muttered, shifting the car into gear. I didn't argue. Neither did Sarah. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the side mirror. The man was gone, swallowed by the night. But the pit in my stomach remained, a gnawing sense of unease that wouldn't go away. "What the hell was that?" I finally whispered, breaking the silence. Luke shook his head. "I don't know, but I'm glad he's gone." Sarah, who had been so insistent on picking him up, was quiet now, her face pale as she stared out the window. He was weird," she finally said. "Really weird." We drove in silence for a while longer, the tension in the car slowly easing as we put more distance between ourselves and the man. But the further we drove, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. We stopped at a diner about an hour later, needing a break and some food to calm our nerves. As we sat in the booth, sipping coffee and trying to laugh off the strange encounter, I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through local news. And then I saw it, a report of a murder just a few miles from where we had picked up the hitchhiker. A couple found dead in their car, pulled off to the side of the road. The suspect was still at large. My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. The description of the suspect matched him. The man we had picked up. The man we had led into our car. I didn't say anything to Luke or Sarah. I just quietly put my phone down, my hands trembling as I realized how close we had come. We had dodged a bullet, but the memory of that night still haunts me. Even now, I don't pick up hitchhikers anymore. I can't, because every time I see one, I remember his voice, low and cold, telling me to be careful, telling me that not everyone is safe. And I wonder if, next time, I won't be so lucky. Zoos have always been places of wonder for me. Safe havens where the wild and dangerous could be observed behind thick glass and strong fences. There was something reassuring about it, knowing that no matter how dangerous an animal was, it was contained, controlled. Or at least, that's what I used to believe. It was a warm summer day when I decided to visit the zoo with my niece, Ellie. She was 7, full of energy, and absolutely obsessed with animals. I had promised her a day out before school started again, and she couldn't stop talking about seeing the lions and elephants. The zoo was crowded as usual, families with children running around, the air filled with the sound of laughter and the occasional screech of a parrot or monkey. We spent most of the day wandering through the exhibits, Ellie tugging at my hand, pulling me toward the next animal she wanted to see. It was all going perfectly until we got to the reptile house. Ellie had always loved snakes, and the reptile house was her favorite part of the zoo. The building was dimly lit, the air cooler than outside, and the walls lined with glass enclosures filled with all sorts of creatures, snakes, lizards, and even a few crocodiles. There was something about the dark, musty atmosphere that always made me feel uneasy, but I kept it to myself. Ellie, on the other hand, was thrilled, pressing her face against the glass, pointing at each animal with wide eyes. We reached the largest enclosure in the center of the room, where the zoo's most famous resident lived, a massive Burmese python, nearly 20 feet long. It lay coiled in the corner of its glass cage, its eyes half closed, looking peaceful but utterly terrifying in its size. Ellie was mesmerized, standing there in awe, and I couldn't help but smile at her excitement. As we stood there, something strange happened. The lights in the reptile house flickered, just for a moment, casting long shadows over the exhibits. It was so brief that I barely noticed it, but when the lights steadied again, I realized that the python had moved. Not much, just a slight shift in its coils, its head now lifted slightly, its eyes open and focused. Focused on Ellie. My stomach turned, but I brushed it off. It was just an animal, and we were perfectly safe behind the thick glass. Still, there was something about the way it looked at her, its unblinking eyes locked onto her small frame, that sent a chill down my spine. "Come on, Ellie," I said, reaching for her hand. "Let's go check out the gorillas before they close." Ellie didn't move. She was frozen, staring at the snake, her face pale. "Ellie," she turned to me, her eyes wide, and whispered, "It's watching me." I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my neck. "It's just a snake, sweetie. It can't hurt you." But as soon as I said it, the python shifted again. This time, it moved with purpose, its massive body uncoiling slowly as it slithered toward the glass. Its eyes never left Ellie. I pulled her back, my heart racing. "Let's go." Ellie hesitated, but I practically dragged her away, glancing back at the enclosure as we left. The snake was pressed against the glass now, its tongue flicking out, tasting the air. My chest tightened. I didn't like the way it was acting. It felt wrong. We hurried out of the reptile house, back into the sunlight, and I tried to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me. Ellie was quiet now, her usual energy gone, and she clung to my hand as we made our way to the next exhibit. The rest of the afternoon passed uneventfully, though I couldn't stop thinking about the way the python had watched Ellie. It was irrational, I knew that, but there was something in those cold, reptilian eyes that I couldn't forget. As the day came to an end, we made our way toward the exit, Ellie yawning and dragging her feet. The zoo was beginning to empty out, the crowds thinning as families headed home. We passed by the entrance to the reptile house again, and I glanced at it, half expecting to see the python pressed against the glass, waiting. But what I saw instead made my blood run cold. The doors were sealed off with yellow caution tape. A couple of zookeepers stood outside, talking in low voices, their expressions grim. A few bystanders were gathered around, murmuring and pointing toward the building. I slowed down, my grip tightening on Ellie's hand. "What's going on?" I asked one of the bystanders, a middle-aged woman with a worried look on her face. She shook her head, her voice hushed. "They said one of the snakes is missing. It broke out of its enclosure." My heart skipped a beat. "Which snake?" She glanced toward the building. "The big one, the Burmese python." My blood turned to ice. I looked down at Ellie, who was staring up at me, her face pale again. "It's watching me," she had said. The memory of the snake's unblinking eyes, the way it had moved toward her, came flooding back. I didn't wait to hear any more. Grabbing Ellie's hand tighter, I hurried her toward the exit, my heart pounding in my chest. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the snake slithering after us, its massive body weaving through the crowd. I could still feel its eyes on us, cold and calculating. We got to the car, and I threw our things into the back seat, my hands shaking. Ellie climbed into her seat without a word, still unusually quiet. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, my eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the snake was still following us. That somehow it had marked Ellie, locked onto her as its prey. For days afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I scoured the news for updates, but there was no mention of the python being found. It was like it had vanished, slipping into the cracks of the city, waiting. Ellie hasn't asked to go back to the zoo since that day. She doesn't talk about the python either, but sometimes I catch her staring out the window at night, her eyes wide like she's watching for something. I know it's ridiculous, but every time I pass by a shadow or hear a rustle in the bushes, I wonder if it's still out there, if it's still watching us. And I can't help but feel that one day, it will come for her. There's something comforting about the ritual of going to a movie theater. The smell of popcorn, the dim lights, the quiet hum of anticipation as the trailers roll. I've always loved the experience, so when my friend Jamie asked if I wanted to catch a late-night horror flick at the old theater downtown, I jumped at the chance. It wasn't a fancy cinema, but it had charm. One of those old, single-screen theaters with velvet seats and a huge curtain that pulled back before the film started. We showed up just before midnight, the theater nearly empty. Only a handful of people sat scattered around the room, most of them seated in the back. I always liked sitting closer to the screen, where the world outside seemed to disappear as the lights dimmed. So, Jamie and I settled into our seats about 6 rows from the front, tossing our jackets over the empty chairs beside us. As the lights went down and the opening credits rolled, I let myself sink into the familiar darkness, the comfort of the big screen in front of me. The movie started, one of those indie horror films that builds slow, focusing more on atmosphere than jump scares. I was engrossed, my heart racing with the slow tension of the story. Halfway through the movie, I noticed something strange. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure moving in the aisle. It wasn't unusual for someone to get up during a film, but what caught my attention was the way this person moved, slow, deliberate, almost creeping between the rows of seats. I glanced over at Jamie, who was too focused on the movie to notice. The figure stopped near our row, standing just at the edge of the aisle. My pulse quickened, but I brushed it off. It was just someone trying to find a seat, right? But then they didn't sit down. They just stood there still as a statue, barely visible in the dim light. I tried to focus on the screen again, but my eyes kept darting back to the figure, my heart pounding in my chest. There was something unsettling about the way they were just standing there, watching. After what felt like forever, the figure finally moved, slipping into a seat a few rows behind us. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and focus on the movie, but the tension stayed with me, prickling at the back of my neck. I couldn't help but feel like someone was watching us. Not the movie, but us. About 20 minutes later, Jamie leaned over. "I'm going to go grab some water," she whispered, standing up and heading for the exit. I nodded, keeping my eyes on the screen, but as soon as she left, the feeling of being watched intensified. I could feel it, someone's eyes on me. Slowly, I turned to look behind me. There was no one there. My heart skipped a beat. The row where the figure had sat was empty now, the chair vacant and the aisle dark. I felt a chill run down my spine. Had they left while I wasn't looking? Or were they hiding, watching me from the shadows? I turned back to the screen, trying to focus on the film, but my pulse was racing. That sense of being watched wouldn't go away. It clung to me, growing heavier with every second. I kept glancing around, my eyes scanning the theater, but the few people left were sitting quietly, absorbed in the movie. Jamie returned a few minutes later, plopping back down in her seat. Did I miss anything? I shook my head, but I couldn't shake the growing dread. The air in the theater felt colder now, the shadows deeper. I kept waiting for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. The movie played on, and the theater remained still. But then, just as the movie reached its climax, I saw it again. Out of the corner of my eye, the figure had returned, standing at the end of the aisle, staring down at us. This time, I could feel their gaze piercing through the darkness. I froze. My throat went dry as I tried to focus on the screen, but my heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear the dialogue. When the credits finally rolled, the lights came up, and I shot a glance toward the aisle. The figure was gone again, as if they'd never been there at all. My stomach twisted with unease as Jamie stood up, stretching and yawning like nothing was wrong. "Ready to go?" she asked, grinning. I nodded, trying to smile, but my hands were shaking as I grabbed my jacket. As we left the theater, I glanced back one last time at the rows of empty seats. The shadows seemed to shift, and for a moment I thought I saw movement, just a flicker barely visible. But when I blinked, it was gone. To this day, I don't know who or what was watching us that night. But I haven't gone back to that theater. And now, whenever I sit in a dark room, I can't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, is watching me, waiting for me to notice them. I've been going to the same gym for years. It's one of those 24-hour fitness centers, the kind that's open all night and attracts the die-hard fitness fanatics. I usually go late, after work, when the place is mostly empty. There's something calming about the quiet hum of the machines and the dim lighting at night. It's my routine, my way of winding down. But that night, something was different. It was around 11 p.m., and the gym was emptier than usual. Only a few regulars were scattered around, lost in their own workouts, and I had my usual spot by the weight machines all to myself. The lights buzzed softly above me, flickering now and then, but I was too focused on my set to care. I was halfway through my reps when I noticed someone at the far end of the gym. He wasn't using any of the equipment, just standing there watching. His figure was silhouetted by the dim light, his face partially hidden beneath a hoodie. At first, I thought he was waiting for a machine, but the longer I looked, the more I realized he wasn't doing anything. Just standing there. I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine, but I shook it off. Maybe he was just resting or waiting for a friend. I went back to my workout, trying to ignore the odd tension that was building in the back of my mind. But every time I glanced up, he was still there, staring. After a few more minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I wiped the sweat from my forehead and headed for the water fountain, pretending not to notice the guy as I walked past him. His eyes followed me the entire time, cold and unblinking. At the fountain, I took a long drink, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself I was overreacting. It was late, I was tired, and the guy was probably harmless. Still, something about the way he stood so still, so silently, unnerved me. When I turned back to my workout area, he was gone. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, relieved. Maybe he had left. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I headed back to my weights, ready to finish my set, but as soon as I sat down, the lights flickered again. I looked up, and there he was, standing right behind me, just a few feet away. My blood ran cold. His face was still hidden under the hoodie, but I could feel his eyes on me. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Do you need something?" I asked, my voice more shaky than I intended. He didn't answer. He just stood there, silent. The gym felt unnaturally quiet, the usual hum of the machines fading into the background. I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, and the hair on my arms stood on end. "I'm just trying to work out," I said, taking a step back, trying to put some distance between us. He took a step closer. I swallowed hard, glancing around the gym, but the few other people there were too far away, too absorbed in their own workouts to notice what was happening. I could feel my pulse quickening, the air around me growing heavy. Without another word, I grabbed my bag and headed for the exit, trying to keep my pace steady, try not to run. I could hear his footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, following me across the gym floor. As I reached the door, I turned back, expecting to see him right behind me, but the gym was empty. He was gone. Just like that, he had vanished. I rushed outside, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop until I was in my car, the doors locked, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I never saw that guy again, but every time I go to the gym, every time I step into that quiet, dimly lit room late at night, I can't shake the feeling that he's still there, watching, waiting for me to notice him. And the next time, I might not be so lucky. Hey there, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Thank all of you